So we discussed the off-field climate and everything going on with the game last time, the ratings war between the footy and Alf, etc. Now we're going to look at the teams involved in the comp. And before we get to the teams who ended up in the grand final, Manly and Canberra, just spend a bit of time talking about the previous year's grand finalists. Now, when we get to 1988, you cannot tell the story of the Canterbury in 1988 without talking about their 1987. They had a crazy year in 1987, so we're going to hold off on that. But let's just talk a bit about Para for a sec. So both Canterbury and Para missed the finals in 1987. At that point, that was the fourth time in history that the previous year's grand finals had both missed the semi-finals.
It's a topsy-turvy year.
It's happened three times since then. Once in the 90s and twice in the aughts. I want you to have a guess, a bit of a quiz.
Para Newcastle?
No.
Oh. Warriors? No. I don't know.
Okay, so Penrith and Canberra in 92.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Obviously what happened with Penrith, but then Canberra. What happened with Canberra that year?
Canberra had salary cap and injuries.
And then 2005, Canterbury and the Roosters both missing the semis. And then the very next year, the Tigers and the Cowboys.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So if you jetted back to 1987 and told rugby league fans at that time, like, oh, Parramatta aren't going to make the semis this year, they'd be like, what? You're crazy. If you said, oh, and by the way, they're not going to get back to the semis for a decade or so and they won't win another comp again.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. So they started that year as 5-2 favourites.
But they'd lost Cronin and Price.
They lost Cronin and Price. But everyone just, I mean, we're going to talk a bit about what those blokes offered. But I mean, realistically, it's like a couple of players in their 30s that had their best days. They still had the best player in the world in Peter Sterling. They still had Brett Kenny, and they still had seemingly a good squad.
Yeah.
Early in the season, Canterbury beat Parramatta quite easily, and Steve Mortimer, who was writing Rugby League Week that year, said, Parramatta are still going to be contenders and semi-finalists in 1987. That's the long view. And that was the kind of climate at the time. It was like, oh yeah, they're having troubles at the moment, but they're Parramatta. They'll come good. You know? And in an early warning sign, they got belted by Balmain. So Parramatta kind of came good eventually, but had left their run too late. They played like one of the games of the year against Manly late in the season that Manly won, a real epic game, but the damage was done. They ended up in 7th place. So let's just talk about a couple of those reasons they mightn't have made the finals. And Cronin and Price seem to have played a major part in it, like just everything they offered off the field. Again, I'm going to quote Steve Mortimer, who said that Cronin hadn't played that much over the last couple of seasons with injury, but was still a big presence. He said, Price, though, was the big one. He was a bastard to play against. You could never relax for a second. If you did, he'd pinch 20 yards off you. He was a mongraler, a controlled, aggressive player who would hunt the ball and take his forwards with him.
Have you ever heard anyone describe him with anything other than like begrudging reverence?
Yeah.
He's just an amazing player.
And that was a lot of talk that other Parramatta players didn't seem to care about losing as much as he did once he was gone, you know?
I compare him to like Draymond Green for the Golden State Warriors. You just need that 1% of the mongrel.
Yeah. And Cronin and Price had very different years in retirement. Price was out and proud in the media. He was on, I can't remember if it was 2UE or 2GB that year.
I think it was 2UE.
It was 2UE?
Yeah. Memory.
And I love, and he was also writing for Rugby League Week as well. I love his columns in Rugby League Week so much. I'll give you an example. How dare Manly rant and rave over referees? Have they forgotten the times when they savagely ridiculed Parramatta every time we complained back in the late 70s, particularly about a man called Greg Hartley? Have they forgotten how our big feud began in 1978? Because I certainly haven't. And he made on one radio broadcast when Canterbury were playing Parramatta, he said that Canterbury liked Mick Stone as a referee, but Parramatta liked Kevin Roberts. Who got the game? Mick Stone. There's a conspiracy against Parramatta. But this was the ultimate what if that I really wish that happened. Friend of the show, Kevin Ryan, who had by that stage left the Labor Party to start his own breakaway political party, tried to recruit Ray Price to the party.
That would be the hardest political party in history.
Mick Cronin, on the other hand, went straight back to Gerringong, of course. Coached the...
And did what?
Well, in addition to his publican venture, he also coached the Gerringong Lions that year and took them to their first grand final since he played there in 1972.
Wow.
Yeah. I forgot to track it down whether they won or not, so that's as much as I can tell you. And so a lot of the talk about why Parramatta had fallen off so badly was about their failure to recruit. Some of the players they had weren't up to standard. One player that was up to standard was Bob Lidner, who played his first year at Parramatta that year.
I love Bob Lidner.
So when Ray Price retired from rep footy in 1984, he made a big show of handing over his jersey to Wayne Pearce, and it was like, this is the next guy in line. But by 1987, Bob Lindner was, had pushed Wayne Pearce out to the second row and was widely regarded as the best lock in the game.
Yeah, he was great.
He had mixed form in his 2 years at Para and ended up leaving due to the age-old homesickness clause. His girlfriend wanted to go back to Queensland. So he signed. This is what I don't understand. He signed with the Gold Coast. Like, surely the Broncos would have had some interest in Bob Lindner.
Pre-salary cap.
Yeah.
Thoroughbreds.
Yeah.
Money.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Doesn't make any sense to me. I wonder if there was something between him and Bennett.
Yeah, possibly.
But so he went to the Gold Coast only last year, then came back to Sydney. So I think his wife got over it. But went to West, went to Illawarra. I mean, there were a couple of good years at West, but it's kind of a shame that his club career was...
Well, he had a strong rep career into the 90s. He was a part of that, my favourite ever back row of Clyde, Lidner and Fittler. But his club career wasn't as big as the Parramatta days.
Yeah. And even then, like, it was a couple of years of mixed form,
Yeah.
I always, growing up, I never quite got it. Like, Bradley Clyde, I got, it was so much easier to understand why he was, a great player.
Clyde was great in '89, but he was hurt from there on out.
Yeah.
So he's always playing on one leg or coming back from injury. So it's kind of like I didn't really see the best of him. I was sort of a young kid still.
Yeah. And one theory I had before I started looking into this was John Money. Was he just not a very good coach? I always thought he inherited this champion Parramatta team. He fell on his ass into this all-time great Wigan team.
Yeah.
I only really remember him at the Warriors, really.
Yeah, don't crucify a guy with the Warriors.
No, I'm not. But that was my theory. I'm maybe John Money just wasn't very good. But hearing Sterlo had the utmost respect for him.
And you know what Sterlo's saying is legit.
So Sterlo said, he said, the 1986 win justified and supported the coaching ability of John Money. Money's team had won the two major competitions in the year. That was perfection. We went so close in 84, then reasonably close in 85. Now we were there. Money's reputation zoomed from being a good coach to being premiership winning coach, and we were all delighted for him.
That's nice.
And then the other big talking point with Parramatta was the regression of Kenny and, in the early part of the season, Peter Sterling. So we mentioned in the first part of this history corner that Sterling went on to have, one of the best seasons ever, won every award possible. And it wasn't that he was playing badly at first. It was just that the pressure of having an underperforming team around him was starting to show some cracks. And then there was even talk of him being replaced in New South Wales by Des Hasler. That had more to do with Hasler's good form than any bad form of Peter Sterling. And by the end of the year, he'd certainly, stamped his authority on the competition.
One thing that he didn't really have was the 30 Origin career, Sterlo. He had the Mortimer years, he had 14 Origins or something, or 12 Origins or something.
And that's the other crazy thing about this, So Brett Kenny played his last test against New Zealand mid-year and had the worst game of his rep career. He got injured in 88, retired from rep footy. He never played rep footy again. Sterling played in 88, and then he was done with rep footy.
End of an era, yeah.
And of the back end of his career, Kenny said, "In the latter years of my career, I happily devoted myself in total to Parramatta. There were no rep duties, no diversions or distractions, just the club that had given me my chance. For 5 active seasons and 1 inactive one while I was injured, I was a club player and nothing else. The disappointment was that during that time, my club did not once make the semi-finals and twice almost won the wooden spoon with me as captain."
Sad ending.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's what happens. You have championship teams, and I don't know. You have to go through the rebuild most times.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the most perceptive things about in the after when the season was done and the postmortems were being done. A lot of people were like Sherlock in Rugby League Week said, "Unless I'm a really bad judge, it's a very temporary arrangement. Para are one of the true giants of the modern game, and they'll be back contenders again in 1988." And that was a lot of the talk. But then Greg Hartley, who, to be fair, had his own biases and agenda, I'm sure. But writing in the Sydney Morning Herald, he said, "Parramatta are 10 years away from another premiership and will slip even further down the Winfield Cup ladder next season. It takes a decade for a club to get over a golden era."
Yeah, it's very perceptive. Can I just muse on Greg Hartley for a second?
Yeah.
How bad must have this bloke been that 30 years later, he's still a household name? A New South Wales Rugby League referee has got that much notoriety. It's insane.
But do you think it was the Hollywood and Zorba more than his refereeing
Probably,
career
yeah.
that has kept him?
We're still talking about Darcy Lawler, but
Yeah.
it's just a massive notoriety.
And is it funny that you never still talk about good referees?
I mean, Eddie Ward,
I didn't realise Eddie Ward had been reffing since the late 70s in the BRL.
Wow.
Yeah.
Look good in a pastel orange TNT ref shirt.
Which, I mean, they never should have gone away from that.
Oh,
I know rose-coloured and all, but has any referee's uniform ever come close to matching the TNT era?
You know who loved the red TNT? Greg McCallum.
I hate the ones they've got at the moment.
Yeah, no good.
Yellow and purple.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll move on to the teams who did make the grand final. In Canberra, we'll start with Canberra. So that their 6th year in the comp, they narrowly beat Campbelltown and Newcastle to get the licence in 81.
What's funny about this squad, though, mate, is it's a really, really good team, but because it's not the 89, 90, 91 super team, it gets overlooked.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's a star-studded team.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, you still had some links to the foundation years with, Chris O'Sullivan, Jay Hoffman, and Craig Bellamy, another foundation player. He, didn't play many first-grade games that year. So
still there with the shoulder pads.
Yeah, so you still had a few of the stalwarts, and then you had this injection of the Queensland talent.
You had Mal with the arm guard,
which we're going to get to the arm guard later in the story. And then you had Dean Lance, who'd been at the club since Newtown folded.
He was my first hitman that I was aware of.
Yeah, and that was his reputation, considered, the hardest or one of the hardest players to tackle in the comp. All right. He wasn't even a big player in his day.
Yeah, right.
His playing weight, 83 kilos.
Steve Folks-esque.
It's insanity to think of that. I mean, I know players were small then, but 83 kilos,
Well, he's 24 kilos lighter than me right now. That's no good.
And that backline, so you had basically an all international or an all rep at the very least backline. You had Gary Belcher in his 2nd year at the club, Terry Fay and John Ferguson on the wings, who both played for Australia, Mal Menenga and Peter Jackson in the centres.
That was a killer backline. And the halves were no slouches either.
Yeah, so even though they were rank outsiders at the start of the year, they started 16-1 to win the comp. There was still a bit of belief that they could do something. They'd finished 11th the year before, but you could only look at that squad and see the class. So Ray Price, among many, many things he got wrong that year, he said, "The Canberra Raiders, the most undisciplined team in the Winfield Cup in the past 2 seasons, are my pick to be the Bolters of 1987. And I'm not talking about just a semi-final spot. I'm willing to stick my head out at this early stage and say they could end up in the top 3 and go all the way to the grand final."
Nostradamus.
They did both of those things. And then the other interesting thing about it was the coaching situation with Wayne Bennett coming in and Don Ferner their inaugural coach, was a driving force behind that. He wanted someone to come in and take over. And
it's still weird to me, co-coaching.
yeah.
It must have been mostly Bennett, surely.
Yeah, well, I'll break it down, that dynamic a bit in detail, but I don't think there are many people who could have made that work. It took like kind of a genial, old salt kind of personality like Don Furner,
Legendary figure at Canberra and the game.
Yeah, and a person like a character like Wayne Bennett, who is ambitious, driven, but had an immense respect for old football men.
Yeah, absolutely.
He said that for talent identification, Don Furner, Cyril Connell, and Bob Fulton were the best he'd ever known.
Imagine how fast Wayne Bennett was in the 5K in 87.
So there was a feeling around Canberra that, as my favourite analogy of Don Furner was that he was like the old country GP that had just been around for a bit too long and had lost a bit of the magic. And it's kind of cruel to say about a bloke who'd, gone on kangaroo tours, had plenty of success as a player and a coach, but he was always kind of like the guy before the guy. He coached East before Jack Gibson in the 70s, and then
right.
It happened again at Canberra. But look at the team that he spent 6 years building up.
Well, he's not disrespected at Canberra.
No,
he's a king.
Yeah, and so in practice, it was a bit of, it was more Wayne Bennett running training and Don Furner kind of being the kind of overseer. Wayne Bennett would do the pre-match speeches and all that sort of thing.
Early coaching director.
Yeah. And Gary Belcher said that during training sessions, Don Furner generally took the forwards and Wayne Bennett the backs. So that they had that little dynamic as well. But they're still rugby league guys, and it would be wrong to say there was no ego and no friction at all. And this was magnified when the coach of the year ballot was put out. Wayne Bennett was up for the award, but Don Furner wasn't.
What? Why?
I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, so Don Furner was quite angry about that.
Well, it's not really Wayne Bennett's fault.
Yeah. Oh no, he wasn't angry at Bennett, just angry at the situation. But that caused like him to kind of try to reassert his authority in the media.
God almighty.
Just like, kind of like little things, like when they were talking about whether Mal Meninga would make his return from injury, Don Furner said, "It comes down to what I say in the finish." So just little comments like that sprinkled throughout the year.
Let me ask you, do you think the Wayne Bennett appointment was Mal related? He coached Mal before in Brisbane. It couldn't have hurt.
Yeah, sure. No, it definitely didn't hurt. I think, there's definitely something to that. But
or has Mal had a word in their ear down there and said, "You got to get this guy. He's the best."
I guess Bennett had made himself available because when he took the Queensland job, the QRL said that he couldn't coach at club level anymore.
Right.
And he wanted to coach at club level.
Clubland.
Yeah. So I think once he became available, he was the kind of, the hot young coach on the market. Having Mal at Canberra already was probably an enticing factor for him. And I'm sure that Canberra kind of jumped on that.
Man, Masters tried to get him in.
We talked about him signing with the Broncos and all the drama behind that when we did our Brisbane History Corner, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But at first, Les McIntyre was of the opinion that he'd be fired on the spot, and that's looked like how it was going to play out mid-year. But eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and he got to stay on.
I just don't think they could have won it without him.
Yeah.
As good as Clubman Furner is and everything, I just don't know.
Yeah.
Just having that Wayne Bennett touch of class.
Yeah. And Mal Meninga was also off contract that year, so there was a lot of speculation about where he would end up. And once the Brisbane thing started to happen, it was almost viewed as an inevitability that he'd go up there.
Can you imagine how different rugby league would be if that signing had happened?
I know.
I doubt 89 would have happened.
Yeah.
And then dominoes from there.
Yeah. The other place he could have ended up was St. Helens, who offered him like way more money than he was going to get in Australia. And so he was seriously considering leaving Australian football and going to England. He had this quote about where he'd end up. "I'll go where the money is. I think the time's arrived where I have to look after myself and my family, and with only a few years left in the game, the money must be very important." What really struck me when I read that was, with only a few years left in the game, like, And this, I think, really, when you talk about his case for immortality, just think about this. By the end of 1987, he'd played 18 tests, gone on 2 kangaroo tours, 16 origins, played 5 grand finals in the BRL and New South Wales Rugby League, won 2 comps at Brisbane Souths. Like, those are like strong Hall of Fame numbers at that point.
Yeah.
And think about like all that was to come after
Well,
that.
when he retired at 34, wasn't it?
Mm.
So he was probably thinking, I'll make it 31.
Yeah.
31.
Mm.
And he just somehow made it to 94
Yeah.
and then finished on top.
Yeah. But I love like those little like moments of time, you know?
Yeah.
Reading that reminded me of seeing a picture of Norm Provan on the cover of the Rugby League News at the end of 1954. He'd won their Player of the Year clock, as the award was in those days. And just looking at this image of this, like, you know, young, clean cut, like beanpole, just standing there smiling. And I just remember seeing that photo and just thinking, like, wow, like all of this is just ahead of you, and you've got no idea.
Yeah, amazing.
You know?
Well, I mean, the Mal career is just incredible.
Mm.
He must have surprised himself at how well it ended up.
Yeah.
But I mean, the old rugby league adage, the trope of looking after the family. I mean, Doc should get rugby league players in there to teach the parents that are not treating the kids right, because rugby league players look after their family contract time every single time.
But then how often do they say they're going to do that and take a lesser offer to stay at their club?
Yeah, so anyone staying at a club for unders to win a comp is hurting their family, basically.
So 1987 was a big year for Mal in more ways than one, because it was the origin of his broken arm, which basically followed him throughout his career with these 5-inch fiberglass casts.
That would have been banned in a WWF match in 87. It's like a foreign object city in there.
So funnily enough, the initial injury happened in a game against Manly earlier in the year, where he hit it against a goalpost.
Did he break it like 3 times?
Yeah, so he broke it then. In his first game back, which was in the late rounds of the competition, his first game back, he broke it again and was basically ruled out for the year. Like it was viewed that was it for Mal Meninga that year. So he played no rep footy in 87. That's the other crazy thing about the Canberra run then. They did it without Mal Meninga. John Ferguson and Terry Fay both were out for the year with injuries as well.
But they still had class all through there. Belcher and Jackson were in red hot form.
Yeah. And that was the other thing about Mal's injury. It gave Peter Jackson his rise in rep footy. He was killing it for Canberra all year. Did the same for Queensland, for which Mal Meninga was thrilled about. He said, "I've always said Jacko will go a long way. I'm glad it was Peter they chose to replace me. I played alongside him for Brisbane South, and now we're together at Canberra. I've always appreciated his style of play." And later in his book, he talked about, and Peter Jackson was still with us when this book came out. You could tell how much Mal loved Peter Jackson.
I think everyone in the game loved him.
Yeah, and same with Wayne Bennett. And this is really interesting. I think this quote about Bennett taking Peter Jackson to Brisbane in 1989. "We got Peter Jackson back to Brisbane because I felt we had an issue. We hadn't lifted our level of training sufficiently, and the older players in the group were holding the young guys back. I felt that when the young guys tried to step up and lead a bit, the old guys would get together as a group and intimidate them and hold them back. I'd seen this happen a couple of places during my career, and it had a detrimental effect on the culture of a place. I needed someone to break the clique developing at the Broncos, and that someone was Jacko."
A guy that could be between 2 groups, partying with the young guys and respected by the oldies.
Yeah. Do you think that was a direct point at one W. Lewis?
Yeah.
So Peter Jackson, like a key reason behind Canberra making it to the grand final that year.
Yeah, I was too young to see his prime. I saw him at his late prime, pretty much, but when he was in 5/8 for North and that sort of thing. But yeah, apparently as a centre, he was a swashbuckler, robust.
And how's his bad luck as well? Leaves Canberra at the end of 88, leaves Brisbane at the end of 91.
Yeah, I know, yeah, shocker.
And the other thing about the Canberra squad was the young players coming through, 2 in particular, making their debuts that year, Laurie Daly and Kevin Walters. I'll read this after Daly's first game. "Canberra have unearthed a 17-year-old capable of taking the league world by storm. Laurie Daly who follows in the footsteps of Phil Blake and Andrew Eddinghausen as 17-year-olds to shine in first grade, caught the eye of Canberra and Australian coach Don Ferner when he was 14. Providing he keeps his head, Daly is sure to be an integral part of Canberra's bid for their first ever semi-final berth. Daly has made a real mark at Canberra in recent weeks, and last Sunday, in his first full top-grade game, he scored a brace of tries against Wests.
No one kept their head more than Laurie Daly. Perfect career.
Yeah.
There's been several guys over the years that you just knew from day dot they're going to be superstars. Daly, Fittler, and the modern one, very reminiscent of the hype around these two, Latrell Mitchell. You heard it since he was in Harold Matthews.
And Kevin Walters actually played. He played in the grand final. He was a key player all throughout their run because he was a centre replacement for Mal Meninga when he went down.
Amazing.
So he going into the semi-final against East, he was fully expecting to start before the late game decision to start Mal. So he kind of lost his starting spot when Mal came back into the side. And one of the funny things about footy in those days, like, you know, when they used to show the coaches on the, you know, the top row of the members stand at the SCG. So like grand final day, Don Ferner and Wayne Bennett are sitting there. In between them is Kevin Walters in full like kit, like waiting to go on. Like.
It's such a different era, the replacement era to the interchange era.
You
know, once you're on, you're on.
Yeah.
It was like, two replacements. And
And there was a bit of rah-rah talk. There was speculation that Ricky Stewart would be coming to the club in '88, which he initially signed a contract with Rugby Union, and so that was going to be ruled out. So I don't know how that got turned around.
One of the early blunders from the ARU. It actually amazes me that my favourite all-time player was a rah-rah.
I wonder how you think this rah-rah would have gone, because David Campese had an open invitation to join the Raiders anytime he wanted it, but he ruled out the prospect in '87.
Well, better judges than me reckons that he would have made it, and then Jack Gibson's famous quote, "You can't tackle, I'll get someone else to tackle for him.
Yeah.
You can score tries." I don't know. I just don't. Surely he had to. He was the best player in Union.
Yeah.
O'Connor made it.
On the tackling issue, I'll go to one of my favourite quotes from Duncan Thompson, who was talking about halfback play, and he said, "I only tackled when absolutely necessary, and even then, I would ask why." So Canberra went on a great run late in the year. They were in the hunt, but everyone thought that they might fade again because they had Canterbury, Easts, and Souths in their last three matches. South and East both making the finals, and Canterbury being Canterbury. They won all three of those games, two of them very convincingly, to show they were show their real deal credentials. One of the changes in that season from previous seasons was winning 7 from 11 away games, and I wonder if that holds true for other teams notoriously bad away, whether in those years where they make finals. I'm thinking of the Warriors or the Cowboys. I'd like to look into that and see if there's any correlation between.
Definitely is. I mean, you don't have to look at the stats to know that. That's every time there was a big run from a out of town team, it was because on the away record, because the home record always stood firm-ish.
Yeah.
Even Fortress Brookvale.
So that was Canberra's season. So we'll turn to Manly, who started second favourites at 7-2.
They had a beautiful team back then.
Yeah, it was underrated how stacked this team was. I've got a bit of a preamble before I go through some of those players, but like when I was just putting my notes together, I was like, oh wait, Chris Close was in this team as well. Like I just forgot. By that point, he was like running on fumes. He like barely played first grade that year. Played in the reserve grade grand final. But
he's another guy to have around the club. To lift the club.
Yeah, but so like all throughout the squad, it was like internationals, blokes who'd been there and done it, and great young talent. And the thing about it was the constant criticism of Manly is buying comps, throwing their checkbook around, all that sort of stuff. But beyond Michael O'Connor, who was like the big off-season buy, like hardly any of the other players had played at other Sydney clubs, or if they had, it was someone like Ron Gibbs, who, you know, wasn't like that highly fancied when Manly got him and turned him into a, you know, borderline rep player. And you talk about Mal going to Brisbane, how that would have changed things. Obviously, we've talked about Wally Lewis and Gene Miles all but signed at Manly for the 87 season, how that would have changed things. But they almost got Mal Meninga when he first was going to come down to Sydney.
Lord.
I mean, you can take this with a grain of salt, but Paul Vorton's account of it says that he was signed, he was going to come, but then suddenly it didn't happen, and so Fatty asked him what happened, and Mal said, "Mate, I was keen to come, but I hadn't quite made up my mind. Then one day we were playing a game at Lang Park, and I'd had a few beers after the match and got home about midnight, and just after I got to sleep, the phone rang. It was this official from Manly. He asked me what I was going to do. I said, fair go, it's after midnight, I've just got home. Couldn't we talk about this tomorrow? But he said I was jerking them around, and he had to know right then and there. I told him to get stuffed and hung up the phone. That was it. I never heard from them again."
That's not true, sure.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I like the idea of it, but like some Manly official, like, you know, having a few drinks and just going, oh, is he coming or not? Like,
let me throw a name out there. One name, doubled. Peter Peters.
So I mean, as it turns out, the centre pairing they had that year were no slouches themselves, with Michael O'Connor switching from St George and Darryl Williams coming over from New Zealand.
That's awesome centre pairing.
I love, like, so Michael O'Connor was already, you know, like a dual international. Manly got him, signed him before the 86 Kangaroo Tour. If they had tried to sign him afterwards, his value probably would have been double. So they got a good deal for Michael O'Connor, who coincidentally was working at Wormold at the time.
I mean, every time I still see that company, occasionally I'll see it on a van or something.
Yeah.
It just reminds me of the halcyon days. Like,
Yeah.
there's great sponsorships. Wormhole.
Yeah.
What a stupid sponsor.
But
it's a fire alarm, isn't it?
Yeah. So being a St George fan, like I still remember it, like my dad telling me that we didn't like Michael O'Connor anymore.
Oh, jeez.
And he does have a kind of like, you know, he left St George, he went to Manly, he, you know, finished up, he was with Super League for a while, then he just went back to the Raras.
That annoyed me.
Yeah, like when you never hear from him in rugby league context.
I like when a Rara really disowns Rara, like Stewart, and it's just like, no, I'm a league man.
Yeah,
when they go back, it's
no good.
Yuck.
Yeah, but this is my favourite part about the Michael O'Connor signing. He, of course, had to break the news to his St George coach, Roy Masters, to which so they met in a Sydney cafe where O'Connor announced he was going to Manly, and Roy Masters said, "Not Manly, they've done it to me again."
Up there with the Sattler reaction.
But he made an instant impact and you know, huge reason why they won the comp that year.
He must have been up there for the Rothmans himself.
Yeah.
Because I remember that year he was like the gun back.
One of the other big turning points for Manly that year, after, you know, showing promise for, you know, a few seasons before, was finally nailing down their halves pairing. So there'd always been like a few players in the mix. You had Phil Blake there. Cliff Lyons was playing like lock half the time.
I just can't see Cliffy as a lock.
Yeah, but so 1987 was the year that Phil Blake went to Souths. He got sent off in his first game back at Brookvale playing for Souths, to which he said, "It's ironic, isn't it?" I was like, I know, like, laughing about misuse of irony is like the most hack thing in the world, but like, what's ironic about that?
Let's talk about Phil Blake for a minute, because is he the archetypical sort of me player?
I don't know what it is with Phil Blake.
Like winning comps didn't seem to follow him.
Yeah. When you say me player, do you mean just
selfish? Like,
I don't know if it's selfish or just he just
He was a halfback, and it was more about chip and chase as opposed to organising. I know he's a great player and everything, but like he didn't get any comps, did he?
No.
He leaves Manly, they win a comp.
Yeah.
He had that gun south side, they didn't get it done.
Mm.
You know?
But yeah, in my lineage of like, I always had like, crushes on players growing up. I went from like Slippery Morris, Phil Blake, Greg Alexander, Laurie Daly. I'd always have players that like.
I remember '89. I was a Phil Blake booster.
It was the best ever. He was so good, but for
whatever
reason,
what I mean. All flash.
Yeah.
That's my query. I don't know if it's factual.
I don't know if it's selfishness more than just like didn't have the necessary drive or care. I mean, that's kind of how he carried himself, right?
Well, yeah, so that's what I'm getting at. I look at him, I look at Nick Arima now, and I'm thinking he's Phil Blakeish. He's not a halfback's halfback. Anyway.
I think Fatty's quote about him, I really like. I like Phil. He's a good bloke, but he was always a disappointment to me. Having seen him that year, this was the year where he scored, 27 tries and was like lights out all year in 83. Having seen him that year, I thought he could have been anything, but he just never went on with it. He should have played for Australia at the very least. He had pace, skills, he was tough in defence, but he just never kicked on. He had one good year for South, but apart from that, he just never looked like the same player again.
Yeah, so why is that? A bit of Hainish in it, maybe.
Yeah. It's hard to say, but it's a real shame.
He's looked back fondly by rugby league people, though.
Yeah,
generally.
Well, I love him.
Yeah, interesting.
But yeah, so I did mention that Des Hasler's form that year was great. He was actually neck and neck with Peter Sterling for the Rugby League Week award for most of the year.
He was 7.
He was 7.
And who was 6?
Cliffy.
Oh, Cliffy went back to 6. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I still think Des Hasler's playing career is underrated.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, I think the utility just hurts a bloke. But Jesus, he was great for to the mid-90s.
Yeah. The fact that he agreed to have his book called The Utility Player. Do you know who wrote his book? Thomas Keneally.
Oh, really? Fair enough.
Have a guess where he starts the Hasler story.
The beach at Manly?
No, his convict ancestors. He has a whole chapter like detailing like the birth of rugby league and the history of the game in Australia.
Too funny.
You could tell, like, reading that book that he thought he was going to bring his Tom Keneally fan base. Like, people like, little old, Beryl in Northbridge is going to buy the book because it's Tom Keneally. It's like the least rugby league book of all time. Like,
it must be unreadable. you get a rugby league book, you want to read cliches. You don't want anything said in it. You just want.
But funnily enough, that year he was developing a reputation as a bit of a hothead.
Des?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Which I never really saw as a player. Obviously, we've seen a fair bit of it as a coach. But like he always seemed like,
It had the surfy look, so everyone thought he was chilled out.
Yeah.
But I mean, what I liked about him was he was a consistently 100% giver. So you got 110 out of him every time he pulled on a jersey, especially for the Blues.
Yeah.
Just always rated him.
But you're right, like Kangaroo, multiple origins, premierships, like he was a class player.
Just slotting in at halfback for the Blues, playing on the wing, do a bit of lock, like whatever.
Yeah. And so that 87 was the year that Cliff Lyons finally was a 5'8", and I agree with you. It seems inexplicable to me that he was ever considered a lock.
Well, are we just saying that because of his sublime ball skills and like slow pace of playing the game, slowing the game down to his pace? If he put his mind to it and got in the gym, he probably could have been a sick lock.
Yeah, but a lock in that era, like obviously not in the the modern,
the middle forward lock. But like, I mean, the ultimate 5'8", the 5'8" on which all other 5'8" players judged pretty much.
Yeah,
it's like, why can't we get more ball players like Cliffy?
And how much are Norths kicking themselves?
I mean,
and funnily enough, the reason he ended up at Manly after leaving Norths has some familiar handprints all over it. So he was at Norths under Greg Howick, who was I think 56 Kangaroo. He was brought in to coach Norths by their then chairman Ken McCaffrey, but Howick got sacked after a season because they weren't doing good on the field, And so Cliff Lyons was a bit perturbed by that because he likes playing for him. So Greg Howick happened to be friends with Roy Bull, who was the boss of Manly then, and Arco, who was the boss of the rugby league. Technically not the boss of Manly, the boss of the rugby league. But so because they were all old friends, and it's like, oh, hey Roy, I've got this young fella Cliff Lyons. What do you reckon? And so off he went to Manly.
Talk about the one that got away. Bloody hell! Imagine that 91 style with Cliffy in it.
Yeah. And again, like hothead reputation, like it was viewed that he had to, stop starting fights and, like getting riled up in games.
See, I can't see that either.
Yeah, I know.
It's amazing.
Yeah. But that was one of the big points, the big talking points in the 87 season was that Cliff Lyons had turned around his, hot-headed ways that had robbed him of rep jerseys in 86.
Don't you love it when players really mature from something into something? Like, quite often you'll see Drongos their whole career stay Drongos.
Yeah.
Like, even Dugan's matured now at 29 or whatever the hell it is. But guys like us remember Cliffy as the puppet master playing at this sublimely slow pace. But back then he was erratic and quick off the mark and chip and chase.
Yeah. But, I mean, he never really lost that from his game, like... I remember watching the 88, the Broncos versus Manly game in 88 not too long ago, and there was this one spectacular piece of play where he made this break, but then threw a dumb pass, but Manly recovered, and and then he got the ball again, and the same thing kind of happened. And Rex Mossop said, Cliff Lyons, he touched the ball 3 times in that play, and he bombed 2 tries. So that was always the kind of knock on him, like just taking the wrong decision.
Right, okay.
Which I guess comes with the territory of being, forever labelled a mercurial talent. And he ended up making his Origin debut in 87, but that prospect was looking unlikely when he was omitted from the City Country team, but not... he was omitted from all the City Country teams. And so, City Country was like so ludicrous that year, because you effectively had 4 City teams picked. So you had City first and City second, and then there was also the City Country Origin. So if you weren't picked in one of those teams, it meant that you were outside the top 60 players. And Cliff Lyons couldn't get a run at any of those teams.
Is that the year Sterling played for City?
I think I'm pretty sure this was the first year of City Country Origin.
Right, okay.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if he played in that.
I remember Sterling played, Toowoomba born, grew up in Wagga.
Yeah.
Played for City. And it's like, what the hell's going on with this?
And then there was the captain, Paul Vaughton, who I didn't realise how he got his nickname Fatty, but it was when he first got to Manly in 81 or whatever it was. Fred Jones, premiership winning captain, he was the reserve grade coach at the time, and he saw Paul Vaughton, who just arrived to training, and said, "Who's this little fatty then?"
One of the greatest stories. I remember it from his biography. It was yesterday. But now let me ask you this: today that would be called fat shaming, and he wouldn't have had that media career without that name, Fatty.
But how's the origins of Cliff Lyons' nickname Napper, which I've always not liked. I don't like that.
It sounds like an old English detective's nickname.
Yeah. But this was Bozo's explanation for the nickname. Cliff always had an ordinary-looking melon. He always appeared to have a large head, and the curly hair just made it stand out more. I called him Napper one day at training. It's just a slang term for head. Have a look at your napper, I said to him, and the other players latched onto it.
Jesus Christ. I mean, all through the ages, how bad's your melon has just been it's permeated rugby league.
So Fatty was the captain of Manly at the time, but the Manly board at the start of the year decided to take it off him and give it to Noel Cleal. And it's so funny to think of, Bob Fulton having his, marionette strings all over rugby league for the last 30 years. But the decision was actually out of his hands. He went up to Fatty, just before Fatty was going to be told of the news and said, "Oh, mate, we've got a problem. You're going to lose the captaincy."
That was super close back then.
Yeah. But you had this ludicrous situation where Noel Cleal was injured for the early part of the year. So they took the captaincy off Fatty, but then because Noel Cleal was injured, he got to keep it. but it was like, this sort of Damocles over his head. Oh, when Crusher's back, you're out.
It's very demoralising to lose the captaincy in rugby league.
Mm.
You can always spin it as in like, now I can focus on my own game. It's fine.
Yeah.
But it's a real reputation blow.
Yeah. And in his book, Fatty was like, pretty, you could see how much it meant to him. And at the time he was like, I'm a test player. I've been doing a good job here. What's going on? And they just said, no, the decision's final. We're going with Crusher.
So who made the decision?
The board.
Right.
So Doug Daly, who was Manly boss at the time, father of Phil, who was their starting prop.
The board had power back then.
Mm.
It wasn't just local businessmen
Yeah.
trying to get their name in the paper.
Yeah, but classic bozo manoeuvring. So the last game before Noel Cleal was due to come back, Fatty had a blinder. And so at training that week, Bob Fulton said to Noel Cleal, "Oh, sorry, like Fatty's doing really well. We're going to stick with Fatty for now." To which Noel Cleal said, "No worries, like with everything about Noel Cleal, he just gave the impression that he'd rather be out pig shooting." But yeah, so the bozo kind of took it out of the board's hands, and they had no real recourse because the team was winning. So they were ringing him up saying, "What's going on? When are you going to, give Cleal the captaincy?" And he said, "Well, it's a winning side."
You can't argue with that.
But yeah, so Fatty took it personally, even if Noel Cleal didn't really care. This is what Fatty said: "I was dirty on him. I blamed him for what had happened and I shouldn't have. It probably had nothing to do with him. He was just the one who I focused everything on. I thought there was a conspiracy to take the job off me, and I thought Crusher was at the centre of it."
If anybody's not at the centre of it.
Yeah. Just a little aside, do you know what Noel Cleal's job was that year?
What?
Stagehand on Good Morning Australia.
What?
Yeah.
I love Crusher.
Yeah, I don't know who got him the job, but he said it was it was a lot more manageable. He only had to get up at 6 a.m, which is easy because since we were kids, my brother Les and I would be up early setting rabbit traps or pig shooting, and it's become a habit.
How many pigs has he murdered in his lifetime? Can I ask you that?
But I mean, the results speak for themselves. And on grand final day, there was a photo of Noel Cleal and Bob Fulton and Paul Vaughton around the cup, and Fulton had it framed and sent out a copy to each of Crusher and Fatty. So it was like kind of a nice little
grand final cures all that ails you.
Yeah. And it was, speaking of players in the media, this was Sherlock in the Rugby League Week in 1987. "Media organisations should be waiting with huge nets to snare Paul Vaughton as a commentator when his football career finishes. Fatty is a true original. He's already had one lash on the ABC and handled it like an old pro. Vaughton is both candid to the point of brutal honesty and funny. He fired up the 2GB mob and Howe pre-match last Sunday. Jaws went back into place only when Hollywood, Zolber and Clarko ended the interview. It was lively stuff."
I mean, that's very astute, but it's also obvious. But let's just say about his ABC professionalism, that's when he just goes, "Oh fuck," in the middle of a live interview, and then sort of look disorientated, and Warren Bowen's looking like 1 o'clock half struck. So if that's professional.
Yeah, so that's so rugby league to see. Then you go, this bloke's a star.
He was though.
So the other massive one that year was Kevin Ward, who they brought over as a mid-season transfer from England, and this was in the era where that was going on both ways.
How good is the lineage, to quote yourself, of English imports?
Yeah,
it's just magic.
Mm.
I liked it better when it was half a season.
Yeah,
as opposed to what it is now when you've got legendary English players like Morley and Burgess and whatever.
Yeah,
but the half a season, Ellery Hanley, a fire.
Ellery Hanley's the crazy one because I neglected to mention him in my lineage of rugby league crushers, because he was my guy in '88. I loved it him so much. I cannot believe he only played 8 games for the Tigers.
Yeah, I know.
It's so implanted on my mind, those 8 games.
It's like when I looked up the Ella brothers' careers, because I kept hearing Rara talking about the halcyon days of running rugby. I'm doing air quotes, listeners. And they played 3 tests and like 13 tests or something, like some ridiculously low number. It's like, oh, that was your halcyon days, was it? 3.5 months.
So, and Bozo had the highest like respect for Kevin Ward, even though he only played like that season. Bob Fulton said that he'd have him as his starting prop in his best ever Manly team.
Hard man.
Yeah. Oh, the hardest man, Castleford kind of guy, like, coached by Mal really. And,
Jesus.
And like with O'Connor, like probably the key difference between the Manly of the last few years that would always fall just short of winning and the team that just went all the way. And so he wasn't supposed to be there on grand final day because he had to be back in Castleford, which he knew once he signed that was the case. But then later in the year, as Manly started going good, he realised that he wanted to be there on grand final day.
Well, but I mean, what sort of signing is going to leave before the grand final?
But this is what I'm saying. Like, he knew that was the deal. Yeah, I mean, this is what he said upon signing. If things go well over here, the earliest I can get to Sydney is by the weekend of May 23, and I'll need to be back by August 26. Like, he knew the deal when he signed. And Manly did too, presumably. But so it started this season-long back and forth. Castleford's boss refused to negotiate with Kevin Ward until he was back in England. He couldn't get a release. Even when they finally relented and let him go back for the grand final, and then like told him he had to be on a plane like, you know, Monday morning because they had a game against second division Featherstone, a team they were expected to beat by 40 points.
You want to talk about the Australian boards? Imagine the hard-headed English boards. Jesus.
And this is the other, like, you forget these people are in the team, like when you just keep talking about these players. Dale Shearer was their fullback.
Amazing.
And this was like absolute like prime, like this guy's a superstar. There was even a headline in the Sydney Morning Herald that year: is Shearer a better player than Ken Irvine? Like, wow. All this was on the table, and like, you know, club career didn't really pan out.
Just such bad club signing decisions.
Yeah. Over and over again. One of my favourite like aspects of the Dale Shearer story is the fact that him and Martin Bella were like, you know, Serena school classmates and best friends.
It's so cool.
This was an article profiling Dale Shearer in the Rugby League Week that year. During a game of friendly schoolboy touch football several years ago, a youthful Martin Bella stuck out at his opponent. The blow, aimed at a rascally teenager, glanced off him and to everybody's horror struck the referee. The teenager's name was Dale Shearer. The referee was Shearer's headmaster at Serena State School in North Queensland. And fortunately for Bella, the ref took the accident in good humour. Bella and Shearer, teammates in last night's State of Origin, were actually the best of friends. They spent most of their teenage years together in the tiny sugar town on the Whitsunday coast. 6 years on, they've established themselves as world-class players in the game's toughest competition.
I hope they're still good mates.
Yeah. I think we need to do like a mini history corner on Martin Bella. Like, such a like funny character. Like
But he was like an undeserved villain.
Yeah.
Just because he played for Queensland.
Yeah. And just with the mo and the kind of fatness, like he just looked like a really dumb prop. And then he's like, was the smartest guy in rugby league.
Yeah. And playing the ball backwards. And
everything.
I always thought he's a great player.
Yeah. And then just quickly, Ron Gibbs is the last player I'll talk about, who, again, we've mentioned him before, signed with Gold Coast for 88, and this caused outrage among Manly fans. They held up a sign at the next Brookvale game saying, "Give back Terry Randall's jumper." But another hothead who managed to turn it around. And
when did he turn it around?
Turn it around enough. Like, Bozo had to have a word in his ear after 86 that he had to temper his aggression. And I'll give you two Ray Price quotes as evidence of how he managed to do this. This was on the 4th of March, 1987. Manly cannot afford to have Ron Gibbs in their first grade side unless a miracle happens and he dramatically changes his ways. The bloke can't control himself. And this was the 22nd of July, 1987. Manly are kidding themselves if they have any thoughts of winning the Winfield Cup without Ron Gibbs.
Firstly, if Ray Price is telling you that you're out of control, In aggression? How aggressive have you got to be?
Well, I guess the thing is with Ray Price, it was you always hear controlled aggression.
Yeah, right, you do actually.
I think with Ron Gibbs, it was like wildly uncontrolled aggression. And he did turn around. I think he got, he might have got cited once or twice that year, but he had a really good year to the point where everyone says he was robbed of a New South Wales jersey, and it was probably his reputation that kept him out of it.
This kamikaze, intimidating sort of hitman role up there with the Villa Santi of 2002. Certain teams have always had that trope.
Yeah.
Those guys. John Lomax, Canberra.
Yeah.
You know?
I love the candor of players in this era. This was Ron Gibbs on not being picked for New South Wales that year. I have to admit I was pretty disappointed in not being chosen. When Canterbury got flogged by St George on the Saturday, Steve Folkes, Paul Langmack and Paul Dunn didn't do much. I thought it was a direct contest between me and Paul Sirenen at Brookvale. When Sirenen had a pretty low game and I went okay, I was feeling pretty happy with myself. But that's over now. I've got to keep going. Can you think of any player now going, when these blokes played shit on Saturday, I thought... But yeah, another Rambo. So you've got Fatty, Rowdy, Crusher, Rambo, Napper. Great nickname team.
Except for Napper.
Choppy. And we've got to talk about Bozo.
Nickname of the millennia.
Nickname of the millennia. And just as a coach, so this 87 was his 8th year as a coach in Sydney. He hadn't won a comp until this year, but he'd taken teams to the minor premiership 4 times. Basically, everyone who played with him, he was their favourite coach, and all they talk about is how good a coach he was. The other big thing when he went back to Manly from East is he took Kerry Packer with him. And Kerry Packer basically bankrolled Manly.
Oh, I always think about Kerry Packer being a South fan. Then he's at East. Then he's at Manly. And he's back at East. It's like, what pleasure did he get of bankrolling these other sides?
I know. Yeah,
it's weird.
But yeah, there are always rumours that he was a bit cliquey. You were either in or you were out. But I kind of think it's not like an Alan Jones situation where those cliques kind of reveal something deep seated about his personality. I think the Bob Fulton clique is more like, can you help me win football games? If so, welcome to the clique.
Do you enjoy country outings with rifles and pigs?
And as an innovator, I think maybe he doesn't get the credit he deserves. Fatty said that his approach to using video was well ahead of the curve. It wasn't just put on the game and everyone watch it. It was isolating key plays and everything you were watching for a reason, which sounds straightforward enough now, but it wasn't something that was necessarily being done.
Well, in the old days, they had to put the video on a whole 80 minutes. Imagine keeping a footy team's attention for that. But I remember Bozo when he was the Australian coach and he was untouchable. He was a legend of immortal player and an immortal coach. But this is the making of him, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So he got the Australian gig, I'm pretty sure, the next year off the back of all this.
Yeah.
And a lot of another precursor to the modern era. This was Ray Price on some Bob Fulton's tactics. Let me comment on probably the biggest sham in the game right now, the constant visits by his robot runner onto the field with his walkie-talkie. Other than being a blot on the game, it also belittles his players in a big way. Does Fulton think his players have got no brains at all? Can't he trust them to play 40 minutes at a time without persistent instructions?
I wish we took a heat of Ray Price back then.
This was also the year of the Bill Harrigan, I hope he gets hit by a cement truck incident. Which, Bozo had form in terms of his reputation with referees, and I love this quote so much. This was talking about Ron Gibbs did get cited on a charge that year. Fulton said, "There is no way Gibbs could have done it. I've looked at the incident on the video, and if I was adjudicating on it, he'd be exonerated." And so the cement truck incident came because Harrigan was reffing Manly against Cronulla, and he sent Des Hasler to the sin bin for about his scrum feeds, and there was inconsistent reports over whether Hasler was warned or not.
Wait a second, you got sin bin for what, not feeding in the middle?
Yeah,
repeatedly.
Yeah,
Jesus.
So Bob Fulton first first made the call directly to Bill Harrigan in the tunnel, saying, "I hope you get hit by a truck, a cement truck." I like the time to think about what type of truck he wants. And then he doubled down at the press conference and said, "I hope he gets hit by a cement truck." To which the New South Wales Rugby League's response was pretty poor. I don't think they did right by Harrigan in this. They didn't let him ref a Manly game for the next 14 weeks. And like, he was a young ref at that stage, and they were kind of easing him into first grade. But I mean, what does that do for your
talk about protected species? I mean, there's always been that thing. It's Cameron Smith's got it now, where the greatest ever players ride roughshod over the referees. It's pathetic, isn't it?
But yeah, so Harrigan was developing his reputation at that time. Young Bill Harrigan reminds me a lot of Greg Hartley as a referee. Outwardly, he's not the show pony Hartley was, but young Bill is similar in the way he addresses the players on the field. He's never ever wrong and appears to have an obsession in proving he's the boss. He also has a penchant for commanding centre stage, as Hartley did in his prime. We definitely do not need another Hollywood.
Never has truer words been spoken.
Do you think he would have got tagged Hollywood if his name didn't start with H?
Probably. I mean, they tagged Harrigan Hollywood.
Oh no, I mean Harrigan.
Oh right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because back to the lineage of Hartley, and then also his lariness.
Like, I mean, obviously it sounds way better, but I don't think there's been any other referee in our era who had that same like aura.
I used to go to school with a guy, he's a real funny guy, he's real dour, and I call him Hollywood as like a insult, like that was in the Harrigan era.
Yeah.
But like just seeing that there, like they're just describing the greatest referee in the history of the game as like a problem. So they're even complaining about the good referees.
Oh, like it was all over in this era. In this year, like it was, relationships between players and referees have reached breaking point. Like these were the headlines. It's just inescapable. So the knock on Manly for the few years leading up to 1987 was the Manly staggers. They always started the season well, and then the wheels fell off. And Bob Fulton was often attributed with that blame. The reasoning being that people thought he trained his players too hard towards the back end of the season. And that seemed to all stem from the 1980 grand final where they lost to the Bulldogs, and he trained really hard in the week leading up to it. So that reputation kind of followed him. But Noel Cleal came out and said, because he was playing for East that year, said, no, it was just that the players in that team were big schooner drinkers. It was the only way to keep them from the pub.
Well, I don't like the fact that you referred to them as the Bulldogs when they're clearly the entertainers. But that quote there, right, that just sums up. This is the 80s, and it was still like that.
Yeah, I know. So this was the reputation Manly had, and this was after the Bulldogs had beaten Parramatta and basically ended their season. Steve Mortimer said this: "When the sirens sounded at Belmore last Sunday, I have to confess I felt a huge sigh of relief. Mind you, I'm not prepared to say even now that Parramatta are finished. They're not the sort of side you write off when there's even a sniff of possibility they may revive. But I do know, should Canterbury make it to the final hurdle on grand final day, I would much rather be playing Manly than Parramatta."
Wow.
So again, you wouldn't get a player now coming out and saying that. But
what year did the "don't give the opposition ammunition" come in?
I don't know, because it seems to make sense to not do that.
These history corners have proved, at least to the late 80s, ammunition wasn't a problem.
Yeah. So we were going to finish up this history corner now, but we've actually got a lot to talk about with the semi-finals and the grand final itself.
Can I put something to you live? Why don't we watch the grand final in full and discuss it on part 3 of the history corner?
We will do that, and I invite all our listeners to do the same. So it's available on YouTube. The best thing about the video on YouTube is it actually has the prezos and a lot of the non-game elements of the coverage.
Have you watched it already?
I watched it during the week.
Oh, cool. I'm going to watch it.
Yeah, please do. And again, to our listeners, watch it too. We'll have a lot to talk about next week. So yeah, we'll leave it at that for tonight.